Floor 19, 3 in the morning. Emergency lights, cold coffee, and a whiteboard no one had solved in 2 weeks. Edward Callahan was supposed to be mopping the corridor. Instead, he stopped. Read the numbers. Saw what a room full of strategy experts had missed entirely. He picked up the marker and wrote one line, no name, no explanation, then walked away before sunrise. By morning, Scarlett Hayes stood in front of that board with her entire team behind her. Every cup going cold, every voice gone quiet. The man they thought only cleaned floors had just told them exactly why they were losing. If you've ever been counted out before you could speak, stay. One sentence changed everything here. The whiteboard at the far end of the glass conference room was covered. Every inch of it, arrows connected boxes in colors that had once been distinct and were now a single anxious smear of meaning. Funnel diagrams, retention curves, conversion benchmarks circled and crossed out. Sticky notes overlapped each other like scales on something exhausted. Someone had written WHY in letters large enough to see from the elevator, and no one had answered it. Edward Callahan came through the service corridor at 12 minutes past 3. He moved the way men move when they are used to not being seen efficiently, quietly, with an economy of motion that suggested the body had made peace with invisibility. He wore the gray uniform of the building's maintenance team, and he carried a cart with cleaning supplies on the lower shelf and a folded drop cloth on top. He was not supposed to stop at the conference room. He stopped at the conference room. Through the glass wall, the whiteboard held him the way certain things hold a person against their better judgment, not with force, but with recognition. He stood in the corridor for a full minute, eyes moving across the columns and curves that someone had laid out with genuine care and somehow gotten wrong. He could see where the logic had gone clean and where it had started to lie to itself. He could see the exit ramp no one on the inside had found, because they were all standing too close to the wall they were trying to see around. He entered the room. Beside the board, printouts were pinned to the wall, screenshots from a support ticketing system, user feedback forms, a trend analysis that someone had nearly thrown away and then unfolded again. One page had a single line highlighted in yellow, drop off after verification. It had not been connected to anything else on the board. Edward stood before the whiteboard for 3 minutes. Then he found the only blank corner lower right edge, picked up a black marker, and wrote one sentence. He capped the marker. He read what he had written. He set the marker back in the tray, picked up his cart, and left the floor before 4 o'clock. He did not believe anyone would take it seriously. He believed they would decide someone was playing a strange joke and erase it before the first meeting began. He was wrong about that. Edward Callahan was 35 years old and had been a widower for 4 years. His daughter Sophie had turned 7 in March, and she had her mother's habit of asking the questions that other people only thought about. Their mornings began at 6:15. He made eggs if they had time, and toast if they didn't. He helped Sophie find her left shoe, always the left one signed, whatever form the school had sent home, and dropped her by 7:40. He was asleep by 8:30 and awake again at 2:15 to make pickup by 3. He had built a schedule that looked, from the outside, like a life that barely held together, but which had been assembled with extraordinary precision. The overnight maintenance contract at Hayes Dynamics gave him flexible hours and a consistent income. The technical support work he took on the side padded the edges. He did not complain about any of it. He did not talk about what came before. Sophie knew, in the way children know things, that her father was smarter than his job. She had asked him once, on a Thursday afternoon when he was sitting at the kitchen table rereading something on his laptop with the slight frown he wore when something interested him deeply. "Dad," she said, pulling herself up onto the counter, "if you're so smart, why do people only call you the floor guy?" He had looked up. He had started to say something and then hadn't. He smiled the small, unfinished smile that meant the answer existed but was not ready to be spoken, and said that smart was not the same as important, and that she should probably finish her reading log. She went. But she didn't forget the question. Neither did he. In the building, he was mostly invisible. A few long-tenured staff knew his name. Most simply moved around him with the unconscious courtesy people extend to service workers when they are feeling generous. Benjamin Cross, the head of operations, was more direct. He managed the facility's contracts and made no effort to conceal his view that people like Edward were necessary infrastructure rather than human beings with opinions. He had said, more than once within Edward's hearing, that a clean floor did not require a philosophy. Edward understood the limits of his access. He simply did not always agree with where they had been drawn. Scarlett Hayes had founded her company at 26, out of a rented office space with 3 people, 1 enterprise software concept, and a level of conviction that people described, in retrospect, as either visionary or reckless depending on their current relationship with her balance sheet. She was 31 now, and the company had grown into something real. 64 employees, a product that solved a genuine problem for mid-sized businesses, and a client roster that had been growing steadily until recently. Recently was the operative word. For the past 2 quarters, churn numbers had moved in a way Scarlett could not explain with a single cause, which meant she could not fix them with a single solution. The most important client on their roster, a logistics network whose renewal contract was worth more than the combined value of their next 4 accounts, had indicated, through carefully worded legal emails, that they were evaluating their options. The board had responded with institutional anxiety expressed through urgency and blame. Clayton Mercer, who held a significant stake and had the ear of 3 other board members, had introduced a consulting firm with a turnaround strategy he called industry-tested, and that Scarlett had found, as upon examination, to be neither. Her team had been working the problem for 2 weeks. Analysts had pulled every data set. Product leads had reviewed the entire onboarding flow. The customer success team had gone back through every exit survey and support ticket from the past 18 months. And still the whiteboard kept accumulating theories without conclusions. And still the meetings ended with someone pointing in a different direction than someone else. Scarlett had fallen asleep at her desk 3 nights running. She had started to wonder if the frame itself was wrong, if all the effort her team was expending was the right effort aimed at the wrong wall. She left the whiteboard as it was when she went home that night. She told herself she would look at it fresh in the morning. The whiteboard was not just a whiteboard anymore. It was a record of how much effort could be expended in entirely the wrong direction, when the people doing the expending were too close to the problem, too invested in the framing they had already committed to, and too proud to consider that the answer might be simple. She did not think anything would change overnight. What Edward saw, standing in that conference room at 3 in the morning, was not a mystery. It was a mismatch. He had spent years, before this life, learning to identify the precise gap between what a product promised at the point of acquisition and what it actually delivered in the first 10 minutes of use. The gap was almost always where the problem lived, not in the price, not in the feature set, not in the checkout flow. The whiteboard told a specific story if you read it in the right order. The funnel showed users entering at a healthy rate. The conversion metrics showed them completing initial sign-up without friction. The churn data showed them leaving in disproportionate numbers somewhere in the first week. The sticky notes contained, buried between complaints about interface complexity and pricing objections, a cluster of phrases that kept repeating, "Not what I expected," "slower than advertised," "felt misled about setup time," "the demo was different." The printout on the wall told the rest. Drop-off after verification. The product's onboarding required users to verify account information, import data manually, and wait for synchronization before they saw what the marketing called your first moment of clarity. The marketing copy promised setup in 5 minutes, no technical lift required, instant visibility for your team. The actual experience delivered none of that within the window the copy implied. So users arrived expecting a 5-minute miracle and encountered a 9-minute maze. The moment the maze revealed itself, the moment the first login failed to match the advertisement, was the moment the trust broke. Not at checkout, not at renewal. At minute 9, Edward had recognized this pattern before he finished reading the second sticky note. He recognized it the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years, not because you remember every note, but because the shape of it is embedded somewhere deeper than memory. He stood at the board for a long time before he picked up the marker. He thought about what it meant to write on someone else's wall. He thought about Benjamin Cross, and the precise contempt Cross used when explaining what people like Edward were supposed to touch. He thought about Sophie, asking why the floor guy didn't do something more important. He thought about the last time he had been in a room like this one, a different room, a different company, a different version of himself, and what had happened when he had been right and said so. He wrote the sentence anyway, not because he thought they would listen, because leaving without writing it would have felt, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, like a small deliberate act of cowardice. You're not losing customers at checkout. You're losing them at minute 9 the moment your promise breaks. He capped the marker and left without looking back. He believed, in some quiet, tired way, that by morning it would be gone. Instead, it became the center of everything. The first person through the door the next morning was Mia Foster, the lead analyst, who arrived at 7:42 with coffee and the quiet efficiency of someone who had already decided the day was going to be hard. She set her things on the table, opened her laptop, and then looked up at the whiteboard. She looked at it for a long time. By 8:15, 4 other team members had arrived, seen what she was looking at, and stopped speaking mid-sentence. By 8:30, no one had started the stand-up. They were all standing before the whiteboard with the stillness of people confronting something that reorganizes everything around it. Scarlett walked in at 8:47, blazer from her office door, hair pinned back in the way that meant she hadn't had time for anything else. She registered the silence before she registered the room. She followed every set of eyes to the board. She read the sentence once. Then again. "Who wrote this?" she said. No one answered immediately. Mia had already pulled up the minute-by-minute retention data on her tablet, and the color had gone out of her face in the particular way it goes when a number confirms something you had been hoping wasn't true. The drop was there, clean, consistent, unmistakable. Users were leaving in the largest numbers at the 9-minute mark, directly after the verification sequence, directly before the product delivered what the marketing promised. They had been staring at checkout conversion for 2 weeks. The problem was a floor below checkout. It had been invisible because no one had thought to look there. Benjamin Cross arrived at 9 and found the meeting already shifted. He was a man who believed institutional authority had a physical location, and that location was this room, and the people permitted inside it were determined by title, not by handwriting on someone else's whiteboard. The hall camera feed was pulled. The timestamp showed Edward Callahan at 3:14 in the morning, standing at the whiteboard with a marker, a man in a gray maintenance uniform, writing on the CEO's whiteboard, in an empty room, in the middle of the night. The silence in the room changed quality. By 9:20, Edward was standing in the doorway in his overnight uniform, faintly smelling of the industrial glass cleaner he had used on the lobby doors an hour before, looking at a room full of people who were looking at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. Benjamin's opening was a statement dressed as a question. "Would you like to explain what gave you the right to touch equipment in a restricted workspace?" Edward said he was sorry for overstepping. He said if the sentence was wrong, they should erase it. Mia said the sentence was not wrong. The temperature in the room shifted again. A junior analyst asked, almost involuntarily, how Edward had known. Edward looked at the whiteboard, then back at the room, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned to measure how much truth a given space can hold. He said he had read the support ticket data on the printout. The phrasing in user complaints clustered around a specific emotional experience, not frustration with the product itself, but the feeling of being led somewhere different from where they were told they were going. He had looked at the timeline and found the gap between the marketing promise and the first moment of product value, and that gap was where the trust broke. People don't leave when they pay, he said. They leave when they realize they've been walked into something different from what they were told. Clayton Mercer, who had arrived during this speech, positioned himself near the door with arms crossed and his expression arranged into patient concern that read as barely managed fury. He addressed Scarlett, directly measured, precise, containing a great deal of contempt. Allowing a facilities employee to participate in a strategic conversation was not consistent with the governance standards the board expected. If she intended to maintain investor confidence, she would redirect to the analysis his consulting team had already prepared. Scarlett looked at Clayton for a long moment. Then she looked at the whiteboard. "Run the test," she said. 4 hours. Small cohort. We changed the onboarding message, and we moved the first value moment to before verification. If the numbers don't move, we go back to Clayton's plan. She paused. Nobody erases that line. The cohort was 420 users, randomized from the waitlist of a pending enterprise rollout. The change was minimal by any technical measure. The marketing language was revised to set accurate expectations about setup time, and a single stripped-down preview of the product's core output was made visible before the account verification step. Nothing else changed. Edward had suggested it in 2 sentences. Stop making a promise the experience can't keep. Show people something real before you ask them for something in return. Benjamin Cross had made his position known and removed himself from the room. Clayton had made a phone call. Mia ran the dashboard. Scarlett sat beside her and watched the numbers come in. At 40 minutes, the early exit rate was down 18%. At 90 minutes, down 26%. Verification completions rose. Users who saw something real first had a reason to complete the next step. The support request rate dropped in direct proportion. At 2 hours and 15 minutes, Mia stopped typing and stared at her screen. The retention curve past minute 9 was different. Not incrementally different. Structurally different. The cliff that had defined their churn data for 18 months had, in a small sample over a short window, flattened into something that resembled what their product was actually capable of delivering. Edward sat near the door with a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He said nothing when the numbers came in. He did not look vindicated. He looked, if anything, slightly tired. "You didn't need someone smarter," he said, when Mia finally looked up. "You needed to stop lying to your customers." It was not a cruel statement. But it landed with the weight that certain true things carry, felt most deeply by the people who most needed to hear it. That evening, Scarlett asked Mia to pull Edward's history. Not his maintenance contract. His actual record. What Mia found took less than 40 minutes. Edward Callahan had spent nearly 8 years as a product strategy architect at a software company since acquired and rebranded twice over. He had been, by multiple accounts, exceptional at one specific thing: identifying the place where a product's promise and a user's experience diverged, and building the bridge between them. He had done it 4 times in 8 years. Twice, the interventions had saved products on track to fail commercially. The 4th time had ended his career. 4 years ago, he had been the only senior voice to formally oppose a growth campaign built on a promise the product could not keep. The campaign was designed to accelerate user acquisition ahead of a funding round. And the promise: rapid deployment, zero learning curve, immediate return on investment, was the same category of lie as the one he had just identified on Scarlett's whiteboard, only larger, and attached to considerably more money. He had put his objection in writing. He had escalated it twice. When the campaign launched and the churn followed, and the funding round collapsed, Edward had been the most convenient candidate for accountability. The one who had objected loudly enough to be remembered, in a business culture where objecting loudly is not a survival strategy. Mia found the name of the firm that had advised on the campaign's positioning in a footnote. She recognized it immediately. It was the same firm Clayton Mercer had introduced to Scarlett 3 weeks ago as the solution to her retention problem. Scarlett read this and sat for a very long time without speaking. She was not a person who arrived at conclusions emotionally. She was a person who built them from evidence, tested them against counterarguments, and acted when they held. What she was holding now was not a theory. It was a pattern, the same architecture of manufactured optimism applied twice, by the same hands, to 2 different companies at 2 different moments of vulnerability. The first time it had been applied, it had dismantled the career of the one person who had seen it for what it was. The next morning, she saw Edward in the lobby with Sophie. The girl was in her school clothes, backpack almost as large as she was, telling her father something with the full-body commitment that children bring to important news. Edward was crouched to her level, listening with complete attention, not the performed kind, but the genuine kind. Asking questions, laughing at something she said. He did not see Scarlett until Sophie did. Later that day, Scarlett told him what she had found. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Being smart doesn't help much," he said finally. "If it means my daughter grows up watching her father lose in every room that matters." It was not self-pity. It was arithmetic, the calculation he had been making for 4 years about what was worth risking and what was not. Scarlett heard it and understood, for the first time, that Edward was not waiting for vindication. He had arranged his life around a different set of priorities, and those priorities had a logic more rigorous than anything on her whiteboard. That night, Clayton Mercer's office sent a formal message to Scarlett's personal account. It was brief. The board meeting scheduled for Thursday was expected to address both the retention strategy and certain governance questions. If she intended to present an alternative to the consulting firm's approach, she should understand the votes were not currently in her favor. The last line was not subtle. It referenced, without naming him, the fact that she had allowed an outside party, a contract worker, to participate in a strategic review process. Scarlett replied with one sentence: that she looked forward to the meeting, and that she would be bringing the data. The boardroom held 22 people at capacity. On Thursday morning it held 19. Scarlett, her executive team, 3 board members including Clayton, 2 outside investors, legal counsel, and 1 man in a clean but inexpensive jacket whom Clayton had already tried, through 2 separate procedural objections, to have removed. Clayton presented first. He was fluent and well prepared, moving through his slides with the confidence of someone who has delivered the same argument many times and found it reliably effective. He recommended a 3-pronged response to the retention crisis: a promotional incentive structure to reduce perceived pricing friction, a leadership restructuring within the product team, and a contracted engagement with the consulting firm to redesign onboarding over 6 months. He made no reference to the 4-hour test. He made no reference to the sentence on the whiteboard. Scarlett presented next. She showed the test results, first clean numbers, clean charts. The kind of data a room trained to evaluate evidence cannot dismiss without looking deliberate. Then she put a single slide on the screen. The consulting firm's original campaign brief from 4 years ago, set beside the strategic framework they had proposed to Hayes Dynamics 3 weeks prior. The structural similarities were not coincidental. The room went very quiet. Clayton said, in a voice that had dropped half a register, that historical comparisons were not germane to the current situation, that the firm's work had been unfairly characterized, and that he would be recommending the presentation be paused until legal counsel reviewed the materials. Scarlett said the presentation would continue. Edward had not planned to speak. When Clayton turned to the room and said with precision and force that no weight could be given to the opinions of an individual with no standing, no credentials, and no business being present at a governance meeting, Edward stood up. He walked to the front of the room. He picked up a marker from the tray below the presentation screen. On the whiteboard beside the screen, he drew 1 arc, 5 points on the arc, each labeled in his even, deliberate handwriting: promise, expectation, friction, doubt, exit. He said one thing: customers don't buy features first. They buy the feeling that you're telling the truth. Then he traced the arc with the marker tip and pointed at the place where it broke. He said the gap between promise and first value moment was not a UX problem, or a pricing problem, or an onboarding problem. It was an honesty problem, and the firm that had been contracted to solve it had, in a previous engagement, created an identical problem at scale and walked away from the wreckage. The only thing that changed, he said, is the name of the company paying for it. The legal counsel asked questions. 2 outside investors asked questions. Clayton interrupted twice and was not responded to. A 3rd board member asked Edward a direct question about methodology, and Edward answered it the same way he had answered everything, with precision and without performance, as though the only thing that mattered was whether the answer was accurate. The vote took 11 minutes. Scarlett won by 1. The resolution that passed suspended the consulting engagement, authorized the trust-first onboarding framework, and removed Clayton Mercer from his advisory role in operational strategy. Clayton left without speaking to anyone. Edward capped the marker, set it in the tray, and left to pick up Sophie because it was 2:45, and he needed to be there by 3. Benjamin Cross found Edward in the lobby the following Monday at 6:50, before the building's regular staff had arrived. What he offered was not quite an apology in the conventional sense, more of an acknowledgement, delivered in a tone suggesting it had cost him something to formulate, that the way he had spoken to Edward on certain occasions had not been how he would, in retrospect, have chosen to conduct himself. Edward said he appreciated it. He meant it. The product team sent messages through the building's internal system, which was not intended for communication with facilities contractors but which several of them used anyway, each in their own way. Mia Foster found Edward in the corridor on Wednesday afternoon and said without preamble, "We have degrees. You have eyes that actually work. I'm not sure we got the better deal." Scarlett brought the offer to him on Thursday. She had thought carefully about how to frame it, because she understood from what she had read and from what he had said in the break room that the wrong framing would close the conversation before it began. She did not offer a title that implied rescue or a salary that implied charity. She offered a specific function: strategic product review on a project basis, flexible scheduling, no fixed office hours, accountability to outcomes rather than presence. She said nothing directly about Sophie. She said only, "I think your daughter deserves to hear people call her father by his right name." Edward was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the floor, then at the window, then at Scarlett, with the expression of someone running a calculation that involves more variables than arithmetic can hold. He said he would think about it. The following Friday, Sophie came to the building after school. She sat on the lobby bench with her book open and her bag at her feet. Two members of the product team came through together, saw her, and said hello. One of them called her father, Mr. Callahan. Sophie looked up. She looked at the man who had said it, then at the corridor door where her father would appear, then back at her book. She said nothing, but she closed the book very carefully. The way you close something when you want to remember exactly where you were. Edward accepted the position with 3 conditions, stated plainly and without negotiation. He would not be used as a story in any external communication. His daughter's life would not be referenced in any internal recognition process, and the value he provided would be evaluated on its own terms. Scarlett agreed to all 3 without hesitation. She did not ask him to reconsider any of them. She understood, from everything she had learned in the past week, that a man who had once been stripped of his professional identity, in exchange for having the integrity to tell the truth, had earned the right to set the terms on which he returned to that world. She also kept the whiteboard. The cleaning team had been informed, at her explicit instruction, that the conference room board was not to be erased without her authorization. The sentence, in the lower right corner, remained. It had become, in the weeks that followed, a shared language that entered the culture of the floor without anyone having formally introduced it. You're losing them, at minute 9. The question the team asked themselves, before finalizing any external promise. The months that followed were not effortless. Recovery never is. The logistics client renewed, but with terms that required hard work to meet. The onboarding redesign took longer than projected. 2 more board skirmishes, 2 more moments when the vote could have gone differently. But the number that mattered most, the retention curve past minute 9, kept moving in the right direction. Slowly, then less slowly, then with the confidence of something that has found its actual shape. Mia built a new framework for evaluating product language that started from the user's experience and worked backward to the marketing claim, instead of the reverse. She called it a promise audit. Everyone who read it knew where it had come from. Edward settled into the work the way a person settles into something that fits, without drama, without announcement. He still drove Sophie to school at 7:40. Still picked her up at 3. He had not become a different person, still quiet, still sparse with words, still inclined to sit near the door, but the exhaustion had changed quality, thinned out, leaving something underneath that was not quite ease but was close to it. He and Scarlett worked together in the particular way that 2 people with very different skills and very similar instincts can work, efficiently, honestly, and with a quality of attention to each other's thinking that is indistinguishable, from the outside, from something more than professional. The details accumulated slowly. She kept food for him when meetings ran into evenings. He corrected a turn of phrase on a client-facing slide at 1 in the morning without waking her, and she found the correction and used it without comment. She remembered the date of Sophie's spring recital and did not mention having remembered it. He told her, one night when the building was quiet, and they were the last 2 people on the floor, about the room where his career had ended the moment he had been escorted out, carrying a box of things that amounted to less than the sum of what he'd left behind. He told it plainly, without asking for anything. She listened without trying to fix it. It was the first time he had told anyone. On the last Thursday of that autumn, a data review ran late. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch in the small lounge off the main office. Backpack slumped against the armrest, reading book open on her chest. Scarlett found her there at 9:45. She stood for a moment and then picked up her jacket from the back of a nearby chair and laid it over Sophie's shoulders. When she turned, Edward was standing in the doorway. They stood in the particular silence that belongs to a room where a child is sleeping. Scarlett said quietly, "The night you wrote on my board. Why did you really do it?" Edward leaned against the doorframe. He was quiet long enough that the question seemed to settle somewhere deeper than a conversation. "Because you were fixing things in the wrong order," he said. "You wanted customers to trust you after you'd already let them down. You can't do it that way. You have to earn it before you ask for it." He paused. "That's not a strategy. It's just true of everything." Scarlett looked at him and thought about trust that breaks at minute 9. About the years spent trying to understand why people left, and the night she had slept in a room full of wrong answers, and the morning she had walked in to find that someone she had never seen clearly had been seeing her problem from the beginning. She thought about what it would mean, now, to be in a room that didn't require losing. Sophie stirred, opened her eyes halfway, looked at Scarlett with the unfocused recognition of someone coming back from sleep, and asked in a voice still mostly inside the dream, "Is my dad staying?" Scarlett smiled. If he decides to. Sophie accepted this with the practical equanimity of a 7-year-old who knows the world runs on adult timelines, and closed her eyes again. Edward looked at Scarlett, not with the expression of a man who had been convinced of something. With the expression of a man who had already been certain and was now simply acknowledging it. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Sometimes the thing that saves a company is not a 100-page strategy deck, or a room full of expensive consultants, or a decision made by the people with the largest stakes in the outcome. Sometimes it is one sentence, written in the only blank corner of a whiteboard at 3 in the morning, by the person no one thought to ask, the person who had been in the room all along, and who understood, better than anyone with a title, that the deepest problems in any organization are never really about the numbers. They are about what you promised, and whether you meant it.